Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training, Tokyo, Japan. My special guest today is Ernie Higa, who is the president, CEO, chairman of Higa Industries. Ernie, welcome.
Ernie, you've been here a long time, so please give us the background on how you started here in Japan, and in particular, regarding your early leadership experiences.
Okay, well, first of all, giving background on myself, I was born in Hawaii, so I'm a Japanese American, and but from there I went to elementary school in Geneva, Switzerland, and then came to Japan for junior high school and high school at the American School, and then went to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, and then my MBA was at Columbia, then came back to Japan. So coming back to Japan now for business was an issue because although I looked Japanese, I couldn't speak Japanese and didn't know much about the culture. I really did not get into the culture when I was going to the American School here. But my first few years back and why I came to Japan was that my father had several businesses here, and he wanted me to join the family business, and I did that for about 3 years.
What was the family business in Japan at that time?
So it was in frozen food manufacturing and water purification and a chemical business. And but I think after around 3 years, my father felt, with his wisdom, that family businesses can be a little bit difficult and sticky, and decided to kind of divide the businesses by give each company to one child, which made a lot of sense. But he had 3 businesses, 4 children, and I learned in business school you can't divide 3 by 4 equally. So as a result of that, I ended up becoming an entrepreneur. I was the youngest, so we're going by order of birth. I wish I was born earlier. That would have been better. But so being an entrepreneur and being a Japanese American in Japan, starting out, obviously, number one was to learn the language, but even beyond that, to learn the culture.
What year are we talking about?
So this is 1979. Okay, so basically, starting out as an entrepreneur in 1979, which back in those days in Japan was unheard of, and I had several kind of strikes against me. Number one, because I was not Japanese and I was very young. And the word entrepreneurship really didn't resonate with the banks when you're trying to borrow money.
So how old were you at this time?
So I was 26.
So a 26-year-old guy turns up at a Japanese bank wanting money. It didn't go well, I'm sure.
No, absolutely not. So, that was the biggest issue in terms of entrepreneurship and how to get credibility. Because, as you know, in Japan, part of that is age, part of that is working for a large company, and obviously being Japanese. And so that was the first step. But I gave myself, about 5 years. I figure I'll try it because I'm in Japan, and if it doesn't work, I can always go back to the U.S. I was still young enough to start all over again. And so that's how I started my career. And
what was the business, and how did you start from zero?
So the thing when you start from zero is your biggest asset as an entrepreneur is actually yourself, your own personal strengths, and you have to know your weaknesses. And I figured that through process of elimination, I didn't have a lot of strengths, but the one thing I did have was a knowledge of both cultures. I spent time in Japan as well as, of course, in the U.S. And as I, made an effort to learn the language and the culture here, I had to. I thought I could leverage that, my knowledge of the U.S. and being able to bridge the gap between the U.S. and Japan. And even today, it's a big gap, actually. And so I thought I could turn that into, various opportunities. This is in the 70s, a lot of even large foreign corporations were coming to Japan, but were not able to succeed. And so I thought that was an important asset, and I could do that. And so the first business I got involved in was actually the lumber business. And I was involved in pioneering having Japanese lumber size and specification cut in North American sawmills. And the traditional way that was happening was the large sogo shows would import logs and have them cut in Japanese sawmills for the housing industry. But I was doing the value added in the United States. And part of the reason for that is that in those days there was the U.S.-Japan trade wars, and the U.S. was insisting that the logs be cut in the U.S. and the value added in the U.S., and they might ban the export of logs. On the other hand, they could not cut the sizes that the Japanese required. And in particular, there was a company called Misao Homes, which is the largest end user of lumber in Japan, and they required very, very strict size tolerances and different lengths and different dimensions. And there's, of course, all these various Japanese groupings back then. And so Misao Homes was a part of the Tokai Bank Group, of which Tomen, which is one of these sogo shoshis, was involved in. But they did not feel that they could have Misao Homes sizes cut in the U.S. sawmills, because they could only cut 2x4, 6, 8, and 10. That was a construction method in the U.S. So I took on that challenge, and I was able to develop that business. And the first one, as I said, and as I developed that, I got more and more involved in that. Just Misao Homes alone, I was able to sell about $100 million a year, and then I started to expand to other prefabricated home manufacturers.
So in this process, where are you going with the business? You start to bring on staff. How does a 26-year-old guy convince Japanese people to join his company?
So, as we all know, the key to success in business is really to get good people. And obviously, it's kind of like a chicken and the egg. If you're not a big company, it's very difficult to get good human capital, especially back in those days, because the best and brightest went to government, and then the next would go into to large corporations. So that was the major challenge, even before leadership, just to get people to lead. And the only way to resolve that was actually the Japanese corporations had very strict rules about retirement. And so I actually was able to get people who were retired from large corporations, but they still wanted to work.
The 60-year-olds, the retirement age was 60. Experienced, they got contacts.
And they didn't want to go home and all of a sudden, spend the time with their wives. It was a foreign concept for them, so they still wanted to work. And they still, yes, and they had a lot of, experience and contacts. And so that's, and I actually got a lot of staff from the major trading firms and other large companies that were retired and were more than willing to work. And in joining my company, they would still be able to have not a retirement salary, but a regular salary, and could actually increase their salary and, of course, their position. So that was an opportunity for them, as well as a way for me to get...
So how was it as a leader? Here you are, a young guy, fresh out of Wharton. Most of the people never heard of Wharton, and you're going to run the business. What was challenging about leading much older people?
Well, so I think if I was actually if I was a real Japanese person, maybe that might have been difficult. But not being Japanese, actually, being a Japanese American, in some ways, was an advantage in that because I don't have to play by the rules of Japan. And so being young, if I was able to say, well, I'm not typical Japanese, so, I don't have to be older than you. But the other thing is that even though a lot of these retired shoshimen had been abroad and had experience there, certainly they could not compare with my knowledge or my experience in terms of the United States, or my ability to speak the language, English as well, and to communicate with whoever we dealt with in the U.S. So, you have to identify your strength, and that was an important one. And that allowed me to prove to them that, I had something that they did not have, and there's a reason why that, I could lead them. And I think, but maybe the important thing is that I spent a lot of time learning the language, learning the culture, but in learning the culture and doing business here, but not being Japanese, I learned enough as to what the rules are in Japan and what rules you can break so that you can actually, at a young age, try to succeed in an entrepreneurial way. Because Japan is all about rules and format and so on. And if you go by that, first of all, if you try to do business, the first thing it says, okay, what's the name of your company? If they've never heard of it, then that's already, you're in trouble. And then what's your capitalization? How many people, what your sales are? And if you're young and you didn't go to the right school, then they pigeonhole you. But if you're not Japanese, it's very hard for them to pigeonhole you. So that allows you to break some of those rules. And it allowed me to even be able to talk to the presidents of the companies I was dealing with, which you would not be able to do.
At 26, that would have been unbelievable.
So there's certain rules that you can break because you're not Japanese, and that becomes an advantage. And but you have to know what those rules are, and there's certain rules you cannot. And so it really requires understanding. I devoted myself to really understanding the Japanese culture and the way of doing business. And language, of course, but language you can get a translator for that, but you cannot get a cultural translator. And so that was critical for me to understand.
And also usually translators have no business knowledge, they have linguistic knowledge, so it's totally different. So how many years were you in the lumber business?
Well, I did that for many years. I grew that, and I ended up buying a sawmill in Canada. I was buying from the U.S. and also expanded to Northern Europe. And we developed lumber distribution centers throughout Japan and became one of the largest importers of finished lumber into Japan. But I don't know, maybe over 10, 15 years I did that.
And how big was the company after 15 years?
Well, so we grew it. Well, I was doing several businesses at the same time in general, to a maximum of about $300 million a year.
And how many people? Okay,
so in 1985, maybe we're 20 people, and in 1997, we're at 9,000 people. And most of that was internal growth, of which 8,000 were part-timers, because I ended up also doing Domino's Pizza, where we had a lot of part-timers, but so about 1,000 full-time employees.
At what point did Domino's Pizza come into the picture?
So I started the lumber business. I continued with that, and I also diversified into the medical business, neurosurgical implants, which is a very regulated industry. It's a whole nother a lot of challenges, very regulatory, so you need to have, you deal with the COSEISHO, the FDA here, and just to import products, you need to have lab facilities, lab technicians, and licenses, and then each product has to be approved. So I went through all that process. And again, there needed to be some adaptation for the Japanese market. But that was my strength. It was trying to see, how you adapt products for the Japanese marketplace in niche areas. I wouldn't go against the large companies, but find areas where that were, where you had to be more entrepreneurial, more niche areas, but it could be a substantial business because Japan at that time was the second largest economy in the world. Even today, it's the third largest. So it's a big market if you're able to crack the code. The issue is it's very difficult to crack the code for most people. So that was kind of, if you will, how I positioned myself in the Japanese market. But obviously we had, and then I did Domino's Pizza as I started in around 1985. And again, tying up with a large company in the U.S., but trying to make it successful here in Japan. There are already, two major pizza chains in Japan that had tied up with large trading firms that were not successful. Because I think the restaurant business in general requires more of an entrepreneur mindset. It's not about money or size, really, and you need to have kind of think outside of the box, and particularly in terms of adapting it for Japan. If you take a concept from the U.S. and did the same way in Japan, it wouldn't succeed. So it requires a lot of adaptation, and this is kind of
So by this time, it's 1985. You've got a couple of $100 million size business revenue terms. And so at this point, recruiting people for Domino's Pizza must have been easier.
So, but I'm still not Mitsubishi or Mitsui. So it's still was always a challenge. And as we got into the 80s, you have to remember there was the bubble economy. So everyone wanted people, and our biggest barrier to more growth actually was getting people, both full-time and even part-time employees. And we're basically close to zero unemployment in those days. And so getting people is always a challenge, even today in Japan, and getting good people. And so I always had to deal with that, and even as we grew. But on the question of leadership, everyone has a different leadership style, and there's no one way, I believe, that's the right way. It's just what fits your own personality and your own personal style. And as I was growing the business, I felt that, what I needed to do was get people that were, obviously, they often say this, but it's important, that are better than you in certain areas. But there was areas that I was better than most people, as I said, in terms of like my interaction with our U.S. counterparts and so on. So the main thing, though, I think, is to develop, not to kind of say I'm the boss and be a one-man show, which that's also leadership style. But gain the respect of the people that you lead by also, showing by example, and that has been my leadership style. And it doesn't work for everybody. And there are many successful companies where the top does everything and leads everyone, and everyone has to listen to him. And that's just not my style. I try to lead by example and try to have the engagement, involvement of as many people as I can in management decision.
So you came out of the Domino's business and then went into Wendy's Hamburger, which then became Wendy's Kitchen. So how many years was that after Domino's?
Okay. Well, before I go to that question, but one thing about the leadership style, which was a little bit different, is that when I was doing the lumber business, medical device business, my role as the head of the company was to make very key decisions, and that will determine the sales and profit of the whole company. So in a sense, it was, although I led by example, but it was still somewhat of a pyramidal, or like a pyramid type structure, because at the end of the day, the important decisions are being made by myself or my top management team. But when I did Domino's Pizza, and I found out that's the reverse. It's a upside down pyramid. And the reason why is that the people that make the money or can lose the money or they can drive your business are the people that are managing your stores. So the store manager. And the head office staff are basically support staff to allow the manager to do their job successfully. And the head of a retail business, actually the president, is probably, I can say, probably contributes at least in terms of sales or profitability, because we're not working the stores, it's all about the stores. So when I was doing both businesses, I had to learn how to, be the decision maker for my lumber business or my medical device business. On the other hand, it was a reverse kind of role for my Domino's Pizza business, where the role there was to enhance the store manager so that they can drive the business.
That must have been difficult, because if you're used to being an entrepreneur, running the show, and now you have to give up control to trust people.
Well, you have to do that because we had several hundred stores all over Japan, and so you can't be in all the store. And that's why you have to develop a different mentality for any retail business, and that's how it works. And you have to realize that the store manager is the most important person, not yourself. And so, you kind of play this split personality as I was running.
So the Wendy's business is a similar type of business. So the idea of control being given up is a similar structure. So if you look back at the lumber business, the medical business, and the food business, what did you find worked well in getting people really engaged in the business?
Well, it boils down to developing a strong corporate culture, because you cannot.
When you use that term, strong corporate culture, what does that really mean?
So every corporation has a different corporate culture, and I believe the corporate culture reflects the personality of the leader, and hopefully, that is a corporate culture that the leader can really use to enhance the success of the business. So that's why there's no one set pattern of leadership. There's no one set pattern of developing a corporate culture. In my case, we were just by my background more of an entrepreneurial corporate culture, and so I developed it with various things that you have to, you can write it down, but you have to continuously reinforce it in various ways. But I use the phrase, for example, "can do," and as a slogan, and which is about positive thinking, and it's particularly if you're not a major corporation, you hit all kinds of brick walls. And the first thing to do is just to give up or say it can't be done. But obviously that never gets you anywhere. And so, so when you hit a brick wall, how can you think positive about it? And so a can-do attitude is very important. So we talk about can-do.
That is interesting because the Japanese fear of failure is strong and the fear of taking on extra responsibility is strong. So this can, this idea is almost the antithesis of how most Japanese are thinking about their work. So how did you overcome that?
Well, first of all, as I said, you have to lead by example. So you have to do these things and be positive. And when you're affected by things beyond your control, you also have to react positively with a can-do attitude. And that influences everybody. And obviously the people that are attracted to my company are not your normal, perhaps, salaried workers. So they tend to be different. The reason why they came here is maybe they were not satisfied with the status quo in a large Japanese corporation. So, having said that, it's not an easy thing, as I said, and so you have to always reinforce that. And this is, when I was growing the company and I realized corporate culture was an important thing because we had so many people, and we also started to grow globally. The only way you can control that is to try to develop where everyone's on the same page, which is what you do with a corporate culture. So we're talking about some core values, and it was like globalization. This is back in I started the corporate culture concept in the 80s, but globalization, technology, innovation, environment, even back then we were talking about it, and social contribution, and ethics. And now it seems like these are like, very common themes, like SDG or ESG and so on. But I felt that to be a successful company, those were important elements back in those days. And it's interesting, even the global mentality for the Japanese was a difficult concept. And when I was talking about technology, it's not like IT today where everything's IT. This was, personal computers just starting off, and but I knew that was very important, and so in a sense we're a little bit ahead of the curve. But again, as I said, I was trying to build a corporate culture I thought would be successful, and we're trying. The other I mentioned can do, but the other thing that was our tagline for a company is unique and exciting. So we were going to be a unique company because if we did the same thing like the large company, and went against the large company, we would fail because we are not large. So my whole thing was to not be like the large companies, to be unique. Exciting also meant growth. And if we had growth, then everyone could also succeed within the company. That was the idea of growth. So unique and exciting was the key thing, and a can-do attitude. But these are kind of like concepts to fit our situation because we're not a large company. We're not these established companies. So we had to say, okay, we'll use our weakness as a strength. And, so we'll be different. And, a lot of the staff or the people that joined my company probably could not succeed in an established company. And maybe they didn't have the right background, go to the right school or whatever. That didn't matter for me. And so what mattered was, how they performed. And, obviously, so we had a different approach to, human resource because we had to. We had no choice. We could not copy all the large established companies. That was kind of how we grew our business.
You've got that can-do idea and, it has to get driven right down the bottom. What did you find worked well to amplify that message to those at the bottom?
Well, so, it starts off with the orientation. And so my business has, gone through many evolutions. And, I sold off all these businesses and so on. And now I also changed our whole business. So, for example, Wendy's in a different part, and we have a different office for it and so on. It's arranged quite differently. But back in those days, when we were more consolidated, I developed a training center. And so everyone had to go to the training center. Of course, I would also be involved. And a lot of it was talking about corporate culture.
So if you've got 9,000 people, you need a corporate culture.
Yes, you do. You do. And so that was, and then continuous corporate events, internal events. So back then, for example, as I said, it was very difficult to even get part-timers. So for Domino's, we were the first ones to rent out the hottest, in those days, disco, and have a convention just for what we call the crew, the part-timers, and then motivate them so that it wasn't just a part-time job, but it was more than that, and they get excited. And our agenda was they would be so excited to become a full-time employee, because that was a key issue. So we made it, we did those things. We actually...
This is interesting in itself, because generally speaking in Japan, the part-time employee has a lower status, and you were treating them well. That was quite different from the norm.
Well, in some ways, yes, but like for Domino's Pizza, for example, we actually had students from some of the best schools work at Domino's, because we actually paid a fairly high wage. But most of them would not want to be a full-time employee at Domino's. It didn't have the prestige of, say, a larger corporation. So what we tried to do is, to try to convince them that we are different and interesting. So actually, that was our role. Of course, we had the whole 9 yards in terms of part-timers, but still, most of them were actually college kids, and a lot of them were from also good colleges. But for us, of course, as I said, it didn't matter which college, but the whole thing was, how can we get them to buy into our company and join us full time. But back in those days, of course, it was the 80s and the economy was booming. So we actually had a Formula team, race queens, to enhance the image. And I actually had 3 racing teams. I don't even like racing, but we did that because it was all about people and getting people. But that didn't work. The one thing that did work, though, is I realized that most of the Japanese people, their most desired destination was Hawaii. So I ended up buying Domino's Hawaii. And I figured if I just broke even in Hawaii, we'd have the exchange program then. So we would attract people who would say, okay, you maybe get to work in Hawaii. It's a little bit of a lottery thing. Not everyone can go to Hawaii. But the best people within our company got to go to Hawaii. And so you had all these incentive programs. And that worked, actually. So even, in the 80s, when it was very tough to get people, we were able to get more than, say, our competitors. And so those are some of the things you do.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. You talked before about leading the company, and what did you find worked well in getting creativity?
Well, creativity, I guess it depends upon what industry you're in. But certainly, if we go back to the Domino's Pizza business, when you deal with retail, one of the things you realize in Japan is the consumer is demanding on quality and on service. But the other thing is they like variety. And what that means, you have to have constant product development and product innovation. Otherwise, you won't be in business too long. So if you look at Coca-Cola, for example, in the United States since the 1800s, they mainly just sell Coke, maybe some Diet Coke and some Fanta. In Japan, as you know, they sell maybe 7 or 80 different drinks. Every year, they bring in new drinks, and their main drink is not even Coke, it's canned coffee, and then various versions of canned coffee, and then tea. So it shows you that the consumer here is quite different. So actually, in the retail business, you have to be creative constantly. You always have to come with new products. And that's how it is. So,
is this coming out of the R&D department or out of the stores?
Well, if I knew that formula, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's no real, one way of doing that. For example, we did a lot of customer surveys. What would you like? But the customer only can tell you what exists, and generally, like they can tell you, what your competitors are doing that you're not doing. But it's still important to know what your customers want. And then we also had our own people come up with ideas. And then, I also have to come up with ideas. So, and I came with some of the better ideas for, say, some of our pizza innovation. And that's because, I have a broad experience of, being in the U.S., being in Europe, and going to various places, getting ideas. So there's no kind of one way of coming up with ideas. And, it's a combination of, at least my experience has been, of various things. And then you don't always come up with a great idea. So you have also failures that don't work.
Well, on that point, how is failure treated?
Well, so failure, it's really, I guess, is a responsibility, I believe, of the leader. You're responsible for the success of your people as well as the failure of your people, in general. And the whole idea is how can you make your people succeed? And I think that's kind of of course, it doesn't apply 100%, but that's my general opinion. But going back to product development and so on, I've done so many different kinds of businesses, so it's very difficult. They're all so different. I mean, like lumber business does not require a lot of creativity. The whole idea there was, how can we get these sizes cut? And you go sawmills. That itself was difficult, but once you do that, then it's a matter of maintaining that. Or the medical device business, once you get through the regulatory issues and you can have health insurance, then you're good. But in terms of Domino's Pizza or retail business, as I mentioned, you always have to come up with different products and be creative. And so, just to give you an idea, this is back when we had a couple hundred stores. We were spending, the concept back then was you make these flyers and you have these flyers distributed into the mailbox and then you take the order by phone. So we're spending about $20 million a year on just flyers. And to print out the flyer, we have to say, okay, we're going to go with this product development. This will be our campaign. And then you have to do layout for this campaign. So you go to a printing company. And then they print up thousands of flyers. And then you have to distribute these 1,000 flyers to the hundreds of stores you have. And then the hundreds of stores have to then distribute to the thousands of homes within their delivery area. And sometimes our drivers just throw it all in a garbage can. And sometimes we also use third-party people to distribute the flyers, and you don't know what they do with it. And then, you wait for the orders. And maybe in about the second or third week, you realize that it was a lousy campaign, but you've already printed up all the flyers. And so for the next, our campaign period was about 3 months. So for the next 2 months and a half, you're distributing flyers don't work. So obviously, that's very painful. And so I was thinking there's got to be a better way. And when NTT Data came out with the virtual mall and internet, I said, well, that'd be great, because I would make a virtual store, we'll do a campaign, and if it doesn't work, we can switch. Yeah. So I was one of the first stores to be on this virtual mall. But unfortunately, the sales and the profits are also virtual, and they closed down. It was a little too early. But they were actually the pioneer of the internet mall prior to Rakuten. But it was early. But I thought that the internet still was the way. And so when the time was right, I restarted that idea of starting my own internet website and doing e-commerce for Domino. And before the U.S. actually, the U.S. told me don't waste your time and money on the internet. But I thought that this was a way to reduce the lead time. If we made a mistake we can change it, and we can distribute it directly to the people that. Both the message as well as get the orders all directly through the internet. So this is early days, and most of the internet was done through laptop computers. So we were dealing with laptops, and then went to, of course, the mobile phone, and eventually to the smartphone. We were the first ones when Apple came with SoftBank to have an app on that. But that allowed us to kind of reduce the failure rate. Because innovation and product development in retail business is so important. And that, when I sold the Domino's business, that was about 60% of our sales was through the internet. But that was a kind of an important thing. So you're going to have failure, but you have to come up with ways to deal with it so it's not going to kill you. I think no one does everything 100%. But when you're, particularly as an entrepreneur, you can't afford to have a big failure. And so you have to also be innovative. And, as I said,
What did you find worked well in building trust with teams?
Well, as you mentioned, I think trust is part of the culture. So I think that you just have to make sure that you maintain that trust and you enforce it. There's also a strong work ethic, so you leverage what the strengths of the culture here. But one of the things really is trust. But trust with the customer is perhaps the more difficult thing, to always maintain the trust of the customer, and because that's also part of the culture. And if you have, for example, whether it's lumber or medical devices or whatever, if there's a problem, how you fix that is so important here in Japan, and to do it right away, and it's much more than, I would say, other countries to maintain and get the trust of customers. That becomes the bigger issue, and of course that kind of mentality, of course, goes to your employees as well. But it's really, you're driven by your customers in terms of making sure that trust throughout the company is a key issue. I think that you don't have a choice here in Japan.
If you're going to give advice to new people to be successful here, what advice would you give them?
Well, as you mentioned, I've been here a long time, and I've had a chance to observe a lot of expats that have come to Japan. And not to kind of be broad brush the whole thing, but I see two types of expats. And one expat comes here and says, okay, I'm going to show all the Japanese staff and the subsidiary, how to do business, because we do it here in the United States, and we're successful doing it this way. And there's the other expat that says, things are different here, but I have to respect the differences and see, how I can work with that. Generally, the latter expat succeeds here because it is different. And then not everything, that's, because it's different, that doesn't mean it's bad. The problem is that if you take the U.S., a lot of the companies are so successful because the U.S. is the largest market in the world, and they're huge. So you tend to say that whatever you do in the U.S., that's how it should be done in the whole world. One size fits all, because it is the success of your business in the U.S. But my experience is one size does not fit all, and it's think global and act local. And you have to localize certain things, and that could be in management as well, or in handling your staff. And definitely when it comes to people, you're not managing Americans or Europeans, you're managing Japanese. So you have to understand and respect the culture here, and you might not learn it, but at least know that it's different. And not saying it's good or bad, but respecting the differences and then trying to understand that, and then see how you can get your staff here to perform in the way you'd like them. But it won't be the same as you say how you manage in the United States. And I think the only thing that I would add to that, think global, act local, though. And I'm not sure if this is right, but think global, act local, but don't go too native. If you go too native, then you are managing completely like a Japanese corporation. Then you will miss out. I think you'll lose against the Japanese companies who are Japanese. But it's a moving target. What is global, what is local, and what is going too native? And you always have to adjust. And that becomes more art than science, but that would be kind of the general thought pattern for someone who's come to Japan to look at it that way.
Should they learn Japanese?
It helps. It's difficult. I think, the more you can speak, the better. But as I said, I think it's just realizing that it's a different culture, being sensitive to the fact it's a different culture, and respecting those differences. I think that is very important. And if you can speak some Japanese, that'll be helpful. But the most important thing is really realizing it's a different culture. Trying to learn the culture, as you probably know, takes years, and probably most executives from abroad won't have that time. But you could say that about other countries too, but certainly Japan is very different from most other markets.
What is your definition of leadership?
My definition of leadership. So it went back to what I said. There's no one format of what leadership is. Everyone's leadership style, if it fits their personality, it could be the right style. I mean, if you're an absolute genius and you do everything 100% right, then you should, make all the decisions and be a top-down manager. But if maybe you are not a genius and you can't do everything right, then you have to think of another leadership style. In my case, as I said, I try to lead by example. I try to get the respect of my people, but I also try to, enhance my people and work with my people so that they make a lot of decisions themselves, and because I don't feel that I can make all the right decisions. But that's, again, I think it's a personal issue, and I think there's no one right type of leadership, actually. And I've met a lot of leaders, a lot of presidents, and I'm so amazed that how different all these successful leaders are. And there's, sometimes I think maybe they're not the brightest or the smartest leader, but they are able to attract the best and the brightest people around them, and that's just as good, Or some people I think are completely brilliant, and they can make up for all the people that they can't attract because they're so brilliant. I mean, there's some people are energetic, some people are charismatic, some people are not, and yet very successful. The only common element that I've seen in leadership or people have succeeded is I would say that this kind of like determination or focus and not giving up, but it's really a very kind of passion for what they're doing, whether they show it or not. You have to have that, stick with it, and I guess that's the main common element is really, and I also think to be positive, because in business you can do because no matter how great you are or how great your people are, there are so many things that you cannot control in business. You can't control these exchange rates that have happened. You cannot control the issue of Ukraine and Russia. These go beyond you, but they affect you. You can't control climate change. COVID, that threw everyone for a loop, and so that's way beyond your control. And there's only two ways to react to something like that, which either positive or negative. And I can tell you, reacting negative doesn't get you anywhere. So how do you react positive to a very negative situation and overcome that? And I think that that's an important characteristic of being a leader. And saying, okay, we have an issue. How can we deal with that in a positive way? And maybe you cannot, but you have to have that approach. And also, as I mentioned earlier, just determination. But all the other characteristics, I think, vary depending upon each personality. And you can still be successful.
And I know you have a very tight schedule. Thank you very much for your time today.
And please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.